On a cold December night in 2013, a 59-year-old widow stood on stage at a square dance club in Arkansas, watching some of her closest friends dance together. The woman had owned and run the square dance club for years, and the people out on the floor were just like family to her. But as she listened to the music and called out different square dance steps, she didn't notice that one of the dancers had their eyes fixed right on her, and the woman didn't know that this dancer had become obsessed with her. In fact, the dancer had started losing sleep just thinking about this woman, and now the dancer had decided it was time to act because they believed they would never find peace until the object of their obsession was dead. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast, because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer the follow button a nice, refreshing cup of water while they run a marathon. But don't tell them you've replaced the water with Colgate. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of Monday, December 2nd, 2013, 59-year-old Patty Willington walked across a gravel parking lot toward her favorite place in Texarkana, Arkansas, the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club. Patty was the owner of the club, a spot where club members from town got together each week to socialize and square dance, which is a traditional type of partner dance that had once been extremely popular in the American South and West. Patty had managed the club for years with her husband, Ray, but Ray had died a year earlier, leaving Patty to run things on her own with some help from the most dedicated club members. The couple had always considered Guys and Dolls to be like their second home, and now that Ray was gone, Patty felt like this club was the most important thing in her life. And tonight was her first day back at the club since taking a short trip for Thanksgiving. So she was looking forward to seeing some of her friends and getting back into her weekly routine. Patty opened the front doors, stepped inside, and her face immediately lit up. This old-fashioned dance hall was housed in a metal building that almost looked like a large storage unit from the outside, but the inside was bright and festive. String lights and decorations hung along the walls, and Patty saw a group of older women dressed in colorful western skirts and petticoats, and older men wearing their cowboy boots and hats. And everybody was socializing and laughing and having a great time while filling up their paper plates with food. The moment Patty walked inside, the club members turned, saw her, and shouted hello, and some rushed over to greet her like she'd been away for months. They told her they'd been anxiously waiting for her to come back because they hadn't known what to do with themselves while the club was closed over the holiday. She told them how much she missed them too and thanked them for getting everything set up for the night. As she talked, Patty heard somebody calling her name. She looked over at a long table lined with food, and she saw two of her closest friends waving to her. They were Phyllis Neighbors and Virginia Hyatt. Patty went over to the table and the women hugged each other and talked about their Thanksgiving holidays until Patty noticed it was almost time to start the night's dance. Patty walked across the dance hall, got up on the stage, and tapped the mic, and then welcomed everyone back to the club. And immediately everybody cheered and took their spots on the dance floor with their partners. Well, at least almost all of them cheered. As Patty looked out from the stage, she noticed one of the couples whispering to each other while pointing her way. Patty almost tripped over her words as she began, wondering if that couple was talking about her. But she quickly caught herself and figured she was just reading too much into it. So she wrapped up her welcome back speech and then led club members in saying the Pledge of Allegiance, which they did every time before they danced together. Once the pledge was finished, Patty, with a huge smile on her face, started the music and kicked off the dancing for the night. And as she watched everybody out on the dance floor, this sense of almost complete calm came over her. She knew most people would laugh at her for thinking this, but she believed being up on the stage and running this square dance club was her true calling. It was a way for her to give back to her community and to help the people she loved continue to thrive. The next morning, around 7, Patty stood in the kitchen of her home and poured herself a fresh mug of coffee. She slid her own pack of cigarettes into the pocket of her bathrobe and walked outside onto her front porch. A blast of cold winter air immediately hit her, so she pulled her bathrobe tighter across her body, sat down in the swivel chair, and set her coffee on a small wooden table and lit a cigarette. Now, in the past, on a cold day like this, Patty would have very likely just smoked inside of her home. But more than 5 years earlier, a raging fire had ripped through her home and destroyed half of it. Now, the blaze wasn't caused by a lit cigarette. In fact, the fire had started while Patty and her husband Dre weren't even at home. But they had hired a good friend of theirs from the Square Dance Club, who was a contractor, to restore their house. And he'd done such an amazing job overseeing the construction project that the house looked almost brand new. So now, Patty would never risk lighting a cigarette inside, no matter what the weather was outside. Patty smoked her cigarette and sipped her coffee, and just when she started to feel like she was really waking up, her phone rang. She put her coffee down and grabbed her phone out of her pocket. She looked at the caller ID and saw it was one of her many friends from the dance club, so she answered it. A few minutes into the conversation, Patty heard a car slowing down just beyond the trees at the edge of her property that isolated her house from the main road. Patty's friend kept talking on the phone, but Patty was no longer listening. She'd heard the car turning up her long gravel driveway toward her house, and she wondered who would be visiting so early without telling her they were coming by first. Patty watched as this car emerged from the trees and headed straight towards her, and as it did, Patty immediately told her friend on the phone that she'd just have to call them back. Over 7 hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Patty's close friend Phyllis' neighbors received a call from a mutual friend from the dance club, and as soon as Phyllis answered the phone, this mutual friend said he was very worried about Patty. Patty was supposed to pick him up to take him to a doctor's appointment, but she had never showed up and was not returning his phone calls. And this was totally unlike her. Over the next hour, Phyllis tried to reach Patty several times without any success, so eventually, she called another friend from the club, Barbara Ricketts, and told her that she couldn't get in touch with Patty and she had this bad feeling that something might be wrong. Barbara said she had also been trying to get in touch with Patty and had not been able to reach her all day. And so, at this point, Phyllis said that she was just going to drive out to Patty's house to see what was going on. But Barbara told Phyllis to hold on a minute and stay put and wait for her. She wasn't letting her go out there alone. By the time Phyllis and Barbara finally got to Patty's place, it was starting to get pretty dark. Barbara drove slowly and carefully up Patty's long gravel driveway because the light coming from inside Patty's house was actually the only thing guiding her. Wait a word. She parked right behind Patty's car, and the two women got out and started walking toward Patty's house. When they got close to the porch, they noticed something lying at the foot of the front door. Phyllis squinted and thought it looked bunched up rug. Phyllis climbed onto the steps to get a better look at the object, and when she reached the middle step, she suddenly froze. Then she gasped and quickly turned her face away. She stumbled back down the steps, grabbed her phone, and dialed 911. Texarkana police cruisers and an ambulance converged on Patty's house within minutes of Phyllis's call. A police officer stepped out of his car and turned on his flashlight. He scanned the area and saw Barbara sitting inside her car and crying. And then he saw Phyllis standing in front of the porch. Her hands were shaking and she was muttering to herself. The officer, along with two imps, began walking toward the house, and as they did, Phyllis looked up and saw them and went right over to them and then pointed back at the front porch and said they might as well send the ambulance away, because they were too late. The officer walked past Phyllis, reached the front steps, and right away he saw what she was talking about. In front of the door to the house, there was a woman in a bathrobe lying face up, gripping a cigarette in her right hand and clutching her chest with her left. And the officer noticed that her skin was pale and blotchy. One of the imps walked over and bent down to feel for a pulse, but he was already confident he was not going to find one. And when he actually felt the woman's cold, waxy skin, it confirmed that she was dead. The officer kneeled down and shined his light on the body, and he saw there were blood stains on the woman's bathrobe and blood spatter on the wooden slats beneath her. And it became very clear that this woman did not die of natural causes. Minutes later, another car pulled up the driveway and two men stepped out. Texarkana Police Detectives Paul Noel and Jason Hack, who were about as physically mismatched as two people could be. Noel was round and bald, and Hack was tall and thin. They looked like an odd pairing, but these two men were actually almost always on the same page, and they were both sharp and meticulous investigators. Texarkana, Arkansas, only had a few murders every year, so whenever Noel and Hack got a call for a homicide, they knew it was not going to be an ordinary day at the office. And as they sized up their new crime scene, they could tell right away that this murder seemed especially out of the ordinary. The dead woman looked much older than the average murder victim in the area, and this neighborhood was more affluent than where they usually responded to violent crimes. Noel and Hack quickly met with Phyllis and Barbara, but both women seemed so shaken they could barely talk. However, Phyllis did offer, in a very trembling voice, that the deceased was their friend, a woman named Patty Willington. Hack looked at the time and figured he should start canvassing the neighborhood while the neighbors were still awake. He told Noel he'd be back in about an hour. As Hack walked to his car, he was struck by how eerily quiet it was. Even during the doctor here, he had noticed how the woods seemed to isolate everything and how much land there was between each house. And as he pulled out onto the road to begin his canvassing, he didn't feel optimistic that any of Patty's neighbors would have witnessed anything. Meanwhile, Noel stepped onto the front porch and began examining Patty's body and the area around her, trying to make sense of what had happened. For Noel, there was no mistaking the 5 small, perfectly round wounds on Patty's body for anything other than gunshot wounds. He observed a bullet hole in the swivel chair where he guessed Patty had been sitting, and then another bullet hole in the bedroom window directly behind the chair. It looked as though the first shot was fired while Patty was seated and it missed her. He then noticed another bullet lodged inside the front door of the house, which looked like yet another missed shot. Noel took a step back, trying to picture the crime as it happened. He looked down at Patty and saw the cigarette wedged between her fingers, now burnt down to the filter. He noticed the way Patty's body was positioned face up with one knee raised and now visualized Patty leaping up from her chair after the first shots were fired, and desperately trying to retreat into her house as more bullets hit her until she collapsed onto her back. From how quickly it looked like things had unfolded and how the gunshot wounds appeared to have been fired from close range, this crime looked very intentional. It seemed like whoever killed Patty had showed up on a mission, like they'd come here to kill Patty. Noel looked through the hole in the back of the swivel chair and then repositioned himself until he could see through the hole in the chair and also through the murder hole in the bedroom window, both at the same time, so they're aligned. This way, he could get a sense of the bullet's trajectory into the house. And while he was doing this, headlights suddenly swept across the porch as the coroner's van pulled up to the house. The coroner got out and met with Noel, and Noel told him he was free to remove the body. So with the help of 2 police officers, the coroner lifted up Patty's body, placed it into a cadaver bag, and carried it off the porch. With the front door now clear, Noel entered the home and went straight to the bedroom, where he found a .38 caliber slug on the bedroom floor, right where he calculated he would find it. He then began doing the walkthrough of the house, going from room to room looking for any signs of ransacking or burglary. But nothing appeared out of place. In fact, it didn't look like Patty's killer ever entered the home. It was as if they drove up to the house, exited their car, immediately began firing, and once Patty was down, they got back into their car and drove away. Just as Noel started a search of the kitchen, about an hour after he'd arrived, his partner, Detective Hack, walked in and quickly brought Noel up to speed on what he had learned during his canvass of the neighborhood. Several of Patty's neighbors reported hearing gunshots around 8:00 a.m. that morning. After hearing this, Noel looked over at the half-empty pot of coffee still on the kitchen counter. He'd seen Patty lying dead in her bathrobe, and she had obviously been dead for at least several hours before she was discovered, so it definitely seemed like she'd been killed that morning, possibly around 8:00 a.m. But then Noel wondered why none of these neighbors had called the police if they heard gunshots that morning. Hack said he'd asked the neighbors the same question, and the explanation was pretty simple. People in that area fired their guns into the air all the time to scare geese out of their gardens or deer off their front lawns. So, hearing gunshots would not exactly be cause for alarm. Then Noel started updating his partner on what he had found on the porch and inside the house as the 2 men searched the kitchen. But then suddenly Noel stopped talking. He picked up several pieces of paper that were lying on the counter near the coffee pot, and as he read them over, he turned to Hack with a smile on his face. It looked like he had just found a huge piece of the puzzle. Noel handed over the papers to his partner, and after reading it over, Hack as well got the same look on his face. The first piece of paper was an invoice for a locksmith just a day earlier. Patty had paid someone to change all the locks on the doors to her house. Hack looked up at his partner with his eyebrows raised. If Patty was suddenly changing her locks at the house she'd lived in for years, it very likely meant she was afraid of someone who she knew well enough to maybe have a key to her house. Noel nodded in agreement and told him to wait until he saw what was on the other papers he had handed him. And as Detective Hack started reading those papers, his mouth fell open and he started shaking his head side to side to side, because what he was looking at was Patty's life insurance policy. Each of the beneficiaries listed in the policy stood to gain $20,000 in the event of Patty's death. And the last two names on the list were Phyllis Neighbors and Barbara Ricketts, Patty's friends, who also were the two women who had found her body. Noel and Hack arranged for police escorts to bring Phyllis and Barbara down to the station, and when the two women got there, Noel and Hack interviewed them separately in different rooms. Phyllis told Detective Noel that she had first met Patty at the Geisendal Square Dance Club about a decade earlier, and she had been very close with both Patty and Patty's husband, Ray, and so had Barbara. Noel asked Phyllis if she knew that she and Barbara were beneficiaries on Patty's life insurance policy, and Phyllis began laughing and nodding. Noel couldn't tell if this laughter was maybe nervous laughter, or if it was designed to mask just how important this money may be to her. Phyllis kept on laughing and said Noel's question had reminded her that when she first learned that she and Barbara were beneficiaries, she had jokingly said, "Oh, real cool, Patty, you're younger than all of us. We'll all be dead before we see this money." Noel smiled at Phyllis and sort of played along like this was a good joke. But secretly he thought that everything Phyllis was saying and doing made her seem a little bit suspicious. So after she stopped laughing, Noel asked her to go through her day to help him establish a timeline, hoping that, if she was involved, she would implicate herself. Phyllis said she woke up at 8:00 that morning and then sometime around 10:00 she sent Patty a text message. Phyllis said she didn't really think anything of it when Patty did not reply. She just assumed that Patty was still asleep, and then she got distracted when her friend came over to watch a television game show with her. Noel nodded and wrote everything down that Phyllis said, but privately he wondered if maybe she had sent that text message to Patty just to throw off investigators and make it look like she'd been innocently trying to reach her friend on the morning of her murder. In the next room over, Detective Hack was asking Barbara a similar round of questions, and like Phyllis, Barbara had an alibi. She said she was with her husband all day, and her husband could verify this. Hack leaned back in his chair and looked across the table at Barbara. As much as he tried to picture Barbara as Patty's killer, he just couldn't see it. Barbara reminded him of his grandma, and she looked so utterly shaken by her friend's death that it was hard not to feel sorry for her. But Hack had enough experience to know that he should never take anyone's emotional state at face value. This could all just be an act. And so, as he sat listening to Barbara talk, he found himself calculating in his head how much money Barbara may have been willing to pay someone else to kill Patty in order to still turn a profit on that $20,000 life insurance payout. It was after 9:00 p.m. by the time detectives Noel and Hack wrapped up their interviews. But they didn't want to stop working right now when they felt like their investigation was really starting to take shape. And so, after Phyllis and Barbara left the police station, the detectives began going through the text messages and recent calls on Patty's phone. They hoped they might find something that would give them more information on Patty's two friends. But none of the text messages between the women seemed in any way out of the ordinary. Instead, the detectives discovered something strange that they hadn't even been looking for. One of Patty's most frequent correspondence was someone she had saved in her contacts only as M. After all, Patty and M. F. communicated multiple times every day, and it was clear by reading their messages that this was more than just a friendly relationship. This was romantic, and it was also suspiciously discreet. Everyone else in Patty's contact list had been saved under their first and last names, except for this one person. Hack ran M. F. S phone number through a reverse directory, but all he was able to determine was that it was a mobile phone number because the directory only gave him the name of the carrier, not the name that the phone number was registered to. and so he would need help from the phone company to find out who this number actually belonged to. But he also knew at this time of night that could be very difficult to make happen and it could take a while. So Hack handed over that task to other members of the investigative team. And while he and Detective Noel waited for the results, they started tracking down and calling members of the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club. Even though it was getting late, several of the members answered their phones and were actually quite eager to help the police. None of the members could think of anyone with the initials M. After all. But Hack and Noel quickly discovered that these people loved to gossip. Several of them told the detectives that rumors had been circulating for a while that Patty was having an affair with a married club member, a man named James Hyatt. And as soon as Detective Noel and Hack heard this name, they stared at each other in shock. This was not the first time in this investigation that they had run across James Hyatt, because James Hyatt was the third beneficiary on Patty's life insurance policy, right behind Phyllis and Barbara. In the event of Patty's death, James, like Phyllis and Barbara, stood to receive $20,000. And so now the detectives had three possible suspects: Phyllis, Barbara, and James. And they also started to wonder if maybe all three of them had conspired together to kill Patty for the insurance money. In their conversations with Guys and Dolls Club members, Noel and Hack learned that James was married and he had known Patty for years. Patty and her husband, Ray, used to go out on double dates with James and his wife, and they had become even closer with James in 2008 when they hired him as a contractor to help restore their fire-ravaged house. In fact, Patty and Ray had trusted James so much that they had made him the executor of their wills. This definitely seemed like a guy who Patty and Ray might have given a house key to, so the detectives thought, maybe James was the person Patty had changed her locks to try to keep out. As the detectives were working through this potential theory in Noel's office, the door opened and an excited young cop walked in. He said they had gotten lucky. The phone company had been able to help them and gave them the name connected to the M. After all, phone number in Patty's contacts, and it was a burner phone for James Hyatt. Noel and Hack immediately got in their car and drove across town towards James's house. They still considered Phyllis and Barbara suspects, and they thought there was a chance the women had worked together with James. But based on the text messages the detectives had found between Patty and Miss M, person and now the burner phone, it seemed pretty clear that James and Patty were having an affair, which automatically made James a major suspect in his own right. On top of that, it made it even more likely James would have had a key to Patty's house. And as a final strike against him, he had something to gain financially from Patty's death. The detectives arrived at James's house, but his wife, Virginia, came to the door and told them James wasn't home. In fact, she had no idea where he was, and she was starting to worry that he might have just left town or something without telling her. And now the detectives realized they might be looking at a fleeing suspect. They told Virginia to contact them if she heard from her husband and to please keep her phone close by in case they needed to follow up with her. And Virginia said she would. Noel and Hack got in their car and headed right back to the station. It was late and they were both very tired, but now this was starting to feel like a case they could close before sunrise. They just had to find James. Detective Noel walked into his office and called James's main phone, not the burner phone. There was no answer, but Noel was relentless. He just kept calling over and over and over, and finally, after a bunch of tries, Noel heard James answer. Before James could say anything other than hello, Noel introduced himself and told James why he was calling. But James cut him off saying he'd already gotten the news of Patty's death, and so this would just have to wait because he was out of town. Noel couldn't believe how arrogant and dismissive James sounded, and he was not convinced James was actually out of town. But either way, the detective knew he could not let James off the phone and risk having him disappear for good. Usually, Noel liked to interview his primary suspects in person, but he knew he could not wait for a face-to-face meeting with James. So Noel just launched into an interview right there on the phone. He told James that police knew all about the burner phone and his affair with Patty. There was no point in trying to hide those things. James immediately went silent, and there was a long pause, and then when he started talking again, All of the arrogance Noel had sensed just minutes ago was gone. James sighed and admitted that he and Patty were romantically involved. He only had the burner phone in a different name in her contacts to protect Patty's reputation. After all, he said, people in this town don't look too kindly upon adultery, and the other woman often gets blamed in these situations, so he just never wanted any of this to get out to protect her. Detective Noel doubted that it was really Patty's reputation James was trying to protect and not his own or his marriage. He asked James if Patty had ever demanded that he leave his wife, but James said she hadn't. In fact, he said Patty pleaded with him specifically to stay with his wife. Finally, Noel asked James where he was on the morning Patty had been killed. James said he'd been in Florida, where he still was, and so he was 1,000 miles away from Texarkana when Patty died. Noel knew that there was an easy way to either prove or disprove this, and that was by getting the location data for James's mobile numbers and seeing what cell towers they pinged. So he told James one more time that he needed to get back to Arkansas right away. As soon as Noel hung up, he and Detective Hack put in a request for a subpoena so they could get James's cell phone records. They knew that request would take a little time to be fulfilled, so in the meantime, they reached back out to James's wife, Virginia. They said they knew it was late, but they needed to talk to her, and not long after the call, the detectives drove back to James and Virginia's house, picked her up, and brought her back to the station. And by the time they arrived there, detectives Noel and Hack weren't even sure if it was considered late at night or early in the morning. They just thanked her for coming in at such a strange time, and they lead her into a large office with a conference table. Virginia sat down across from them and, for a second, neither of the detectives spoke. This was not a situation that either of them wanted to be in, but finally, Hack looked across the table at Virginia and asked her if she was aware that her husband, James, had been having an affair with Patty. Virginia gave a little smile and said she knew it might sound strange to them, but she knew all about the affair. Hack and Noel shared a quick look. Like, what was going on here? And then Virginia told them that she and Patty were friends, and there were no problems between them at all. Now, neither of the detectives had expected this response, but they knew there were all different kinds of marriages out there. Maybe Virginia and James had an open marriage, or maybe James's affair with Patty somehow made his and Virginia's marriage stronger. They were not there to pick apart the exact nature of this relationship, but they did think there was a chance Virginia might have information that could directly connect James to Patty's murder, even if she didn't know it. And so Hack asked if Virginia remembered where her husband was when Patty was killed. Had Virginia seen James or even called or texted with him? Virginia said she hadn't seen James at all. She had woken up around 8:00 and that morning and she drove straight to a fast food restaurant to buy breakfast for her mother, who lived in a nursing home. After spending some time with her mom, she had gone home and she said James had already been gone when she woke up, and he wasn't home when she got back, and they hadn't talked on the phone at all. The detectives excused themselves and stepped out into the hall. They had some new information, but nothing that would enable them to close the case or prove if any of their potential suspects were actually where they claimed to be at the time of the claimed murder. They needed James's cell phone data. If his phone had been picked up by one of the cell phone towers near Patty's house on the morning of the murder, they would know he'd lied to them about being in Florida at the time of the murder. Luckily, it didn't take long for the phone company to come through yet again. Now, almost exactly one day after Patty's murder, detectives Hack and Noel received James's cell phone data, which showed his location and movements throughout the morning of the murder. They also obtained surveillance footage from multiple locations around town, and that footage was the final piece of evidence they needed. It had taken just 24 hours, but the detectives now knew who had killed Patty Willington. Based on video footage, cell phone data, the interviews conducted, and other evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patty on the morning of December 3rd, 2013. Just before sunrise, the killer got out of bed after yet another sleepless night, and they told themselves there was only one way to find peace again. They had to kill Patty Willington. They went to their closet and collected their .38 revolver. As the sun began to rise, they slipped the gun into their pocket, marched out to their car, and began driving towards Patty's house on the outskirts of the city. The killer pulled into the long driveway leading to Patty's house, and as they approached, they saw Patty sitting on the porch smoking a cigarette and talking on her phone. The killer got out of their car and began walking toward Patty, who quickly put her phone down and greeted the killer. But the killer was not interested in talking. Instead, they drew their revolver and aimed it at Patty. Patty saw the gun and tried to reason with them, but the killer just fired off a shot. The bullet missed Patty and went through the bedroom window behind her, and Patty jumped up with her cigarette still in her hand. But before she could even turn, the killer had fired again. And this time the bullet hit Patty in the chest, puncturing her lung. Patty clutched her chest and struggled to breathe. She lurched toward her front door, but the killer kept on firing, hitting Patty for more times, including a bullet that struck Patty right in the heart. Patty's legs buckled and she collapsed on the porch, still clutching her cigarette in one hand and her chest in the other. And as the killer watched Patty fall, a sudden sense of peace did come over them. The killer walked back to their car, started the engine, and drove away as Patty lied at the foot of her front door dying. A little while later, the killer stopped along an isolated road, disposed of their gun, and then continued on home. Over an hour later, at about 9 a.m., the killer drove to a fast food doctor-through and ordered a sausage biscuit. And at 9 a.m., the killer walked into a nursing home to see their mother and give her the fast food breakfast. And later that day, the killer returned home and waited for the sun to set, looking forward to their first good night's sleep since they discovered that their husband was having an affair with Patty Willington. James Hyatt, who had been a strong suspect at the beginning of the investigation, did not kill Patty. His wife, Virginia, did. James's cell phone data proved he was in Florida at the time of Patty's death, just like he had told the police. This information led investigators to immediately turn their focus on Virginia, who they had considered a suspect from the moment they learned she knew about James and Patty's affair. So investigators obtained surveillance footage from the McDonald's drive-thru in the nursing home, places Virginia told detectives she had visited on the morning Patty was killed. And those videos showed that Virginia had visited both of those places, but she lied about the times that she was there. And surveillance footage from a convenience store along the route between Virginia's house and Patty's showed Virginia's car heading towards Patty's house right around the time it was believed Patty was killed, and then also driving back to her own house not long after. With that information, police served a search warrant on Virginia's house. Although they didn't find the revolver, they did find a box of .38 caliber ammunition. And they found the blouse that Virginia was seen wearing in the surveillance footage from that morning. They sent the blouse to the crime lab, and it came back positive for gunshot residue. It turned out ever since Virginia began to suspect that her husband was having an affair with their good friend Patty, Virginia became increasingly possessive and unstable. And James, who had been married to Virginia for 41 years, had begun to grow afraid of his wife to the point where he began sleeping in a separate bedroom and even began locking his bedroom door at night to keep his wife out. At Thanksgiving dinner with her in-laws a week before Patty's murder, Virginia had taken James's sisters aside and told them she was concerned that James was going to commit suicide. But James's sisters knew him well enough to know that they did not believe this. And when they talked it over with James, the family became convinced that Virginia was actually planning to kill James and cover it up by the idea that he had killed himself. So as a result of this, James had left town to stay with his sister in Florida. And while he was down there, he filed for divorce. And by coincidence, Patty had just happened to leave town around the same time as James left for Florida, which led Virginia to believe that Patty and James had run away together. So Virginia began calling Patty repeatedly, leaving voicemail after voicemail, begging Patty to return her husband to her husband to her husband to her. On December 2nd, Virginia was served with the divorce papers, and then that night she was at the Square Dance Club where she knew the other club members were whispering and gossiping about her husband's affair with Patty. And so she decided it was time to kill Patty, and the following morning she would. Virginia was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On a dark fall night in 2010, two detectives stood in the street of an upscale suburban neighborhood just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. In the middle of the road, lit by their flashlights, lay the body of a teenage boy. Now, these were two veteran detectives, but neither of them had ever seen the type of brutal violence that had clearly been inflicted on this young man. His legs looked shattered, his jeans had been ripped to shreds, and his face was bruised and broken. The detectives felt sure this young man had been murdered, but because he had no it on him, they didn't know who he was. However, when they did finally discover his identity, this case would take a totally bizarre turn. The detectives would find themselves 1,000 miles away from their crime scene, sifting through reported sightings of their victim that defied the laws of physics, and also grasping at an insane theory that they hoped could somehow tie it all together. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. And today we have a very special episode because we are going to try out a new type of story on the show. It's called You Can't. Now, if you're a fan of our YouTube channel, the MrBallen official channel, you know that I have told several stories on there that revolve around places you can't go and people who went there anyways. Well, today's new show concept is basically that, but for audio. So if you enjoyed today's episode, let us know, because we will do more of them. So if that's of interest to you, please buy a highway billboard ad with the follow button's phone number on it and promise a $1,000 reward to the person who calls and does the best Delmo impression. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of November 15th, 2010, a 16-year-old boy named Delvonte Tisdale curled his body into a tight ball and inched forward deeper into the dark, cramped chamber where he was hiding. He tried to take deep breaths and stay calm, but he was scared. He felt the chamber lurch and shudder, and he realized he was moving. It was really cold, and Delvonte started to shiver, so he pulled his knees tighter to his body. He had never felt so completely and totally alone in his whole life. Delvonte knew no one from his family was out looking for him. Why would they be? It was normal for him to be out of the house for hours at a time, even on the weekends. Delvonte was a standout high school student who got good grades and was involved in several extracurricular activities. He also spent a lot of time with his Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROT group, which is a club for students who are interested in the military. Delvonte dreamed of joining the United States Air Force after graduation, and he figured ROT would help him achieve that. But all that meant right now was that his father and his siblings most likely figured he was doing something for ROT, so they wouldn't be worried about him at all. Suddenly, Delvonte felt the movement of the chamber accelerate. Then he heard a loud noise. His whole body shook, and he felt a burst of heat on his face. Delvonte raised his hands to protect his head, but it was no use. A loud roar shook the chamber and seemed to envelop his whole body, and all he could do was squeeze his eyes shut as he began to fall forward. Later that same night, 6 female college students paced frantically back and forth in the middle of a tree-lined road in the Boston suburb of Milton, Massachusetts. They were all shouting, uncrying, and staring at something in the middle of the road. The object was lit up by the headlights of a black Jeep one of the students had been driving, which was now parked behind them. One of the students kept repeating that they needed to do something fast, while one of the others screamed at her to stop talking. Then they heard another car coming down the road. One of the students took off, disappearing into the darkness, but the others just froze. The approaching car stopped behind the Jeep, and a man got out and asked if they were okay. For a second, nobody replied. Then one of the students lowered her head and pointed towards the middle of the road behind her. The man walked past her in the parked Jeep and looked down at the ground, and he immediately felt sick to his stomach. Detective Louis Bullard of the Milton Police drove towards the stretch of road where the students with the Jeep had gathered and the man had stopped. Bullard could see the flashing blue and red lights of police cars and ambulances ahead of him, illuminating the expensive homes that lined the street. He had been surprised when he got a frantic call from dispatch telling him to get to this part of town. This affluent neighborhood almost never saw police activity. The only time Bullard really ever came out this way was when neighbors called to report high schoolers and college students, for smoking pot and drinking in the secluded hangout spot the kids called the Bat Cave. But the dispatcher had made it clear that this 911 call was about something way bigger than marijuana. Bullard parked his car on the road and stepped outside. He was young with a shaved head, and he was built like a football player. He saw a couple of officers standing with 5 young women in demand on the side of the road. And a few feet away from them, in the middle of the road near a black Jeep, he saw his partner, Lieutenant Bill West. Bullard turned on his flashlight and jogged over towards the Jeep. Lieutenant West turned to him with a dazed look on his face. Bullard shined his flashlight on the ground and saw right away why West was so shocked, because there on the pavement lay the body of a mutilated teenage boy. It seemed clear to both Bullard and West that the boy had been murdered, but the trauma inflicted on him was so brutal that they couldn't begin to imagine how he had been killed. The boy's torso was scraped and badly bruised, his face was mangled almost beyond recognition, and his legs were obviously broken. He had no shirt on, and his jeans had been almost completely shredded. The detectives slipped on their gloves, crouched down, and began digging through the teenager's jean pockets, looking for a wallet or a license, but they didn't find anything. Then, something on the road glinted in Bullard's flashlight. He leaned down further and saw several small pieces of plastic near the teenager's legs. He gestured to his partner to come look, and the 2 investigators stared at the plastic for several minutes. The pieces looked like they all came from the same object, but it was like this bizarre jigsaw puzzle, so they couldn't tell what the object was. Bullard suggested it might be a credit card that had been cut up, but even as he said it out loud, he knew it didn't make any sense. Why would a killer cut up a credit card into a bunch of tiny pieces and then leave the pieces behind as potential clues? Regardless, they bagged up the plastic pieces as evidence to send to the crime lab for analysis. The detectives did a thorough search of the scene and then took another look at the young man's body to make sure they hadn't missed anything. And when they looked this time, they did notice something. They saw there were thick road burns on the young man's legs and side. And those burns, along with the other massive injuries they were seeing, helped the detectives from an initial theory. This young man must have been run over by a car and then dragged down the street. Detective Bullard stood up and walked over to the college students who had been found pacing around the body. These 5 young women were his primary suspects at the moment. After all, they believed this boy had been run over and dragged to death, and the Jeep the students were driving had been parked only feet from the body. When Bullard introduced himself and asked them what happened, the students all started talking at once. They began telling him about this party they were going to when they saw something in the road. They said they got out, and that's when they found the body. And that was it. They said it was just one big coincidence. Detective Bullard nodded, but he remained skeptical. When they finally stopped talking, he asked for just one of them to explain why. If they really had just stumbled onto the teenager's body and were not involved in his death at all, well, why had they not immediately called 911? They were adults with cell phones. Why did the man who pulled up behind them find them shouting at each other on the road instead of trying to get help? And after he said this, the students all got quiet. Finally, the driver of the Jeep mumbled that they were just too freaked out to do anything. Bullard kept nodding, but he didn't really believe her. His voice got sharper and he asked if any of them knew the victim. After all, the boy looked like he was about their age. They all shook their heads, but Bullard noticed that none of them were looking him in the eye. Bullard told the women to wait there, and then he stepped away to join Lieutenant West, who was standing by the Jeep that the students had been driving. But before Bullard could tell West that he thought these students were holding back information, West knelt down next to the Jeep in motion for Bullard to do the same. Then, West flashed his light onto the Jeep's undercarriage, and there Bullard could clearly see blood and brain matter on the bottom of the car that the students had been driving. Now it really felt like they were getting somewhere. At this point, the detectives felt like, these kids very likely had something to do with this teenage boy's death. However, they were not ready to make an arrest yet. The next step was just to have the accident reconstruction team run some tests, but also keep an eye on these students because they could become suspects down the road. Detective Bullard stood up and walked back over to the students. He told them he was impounding their vehicle. He then arranged for an officer to take them back to their college campus nearby, and he told them not to leave town. Later that night, after the body had been removed from the scene and taken to the medical examiner, Detectives Bullard and West went door to door in the neighborhood asking if anybody had seen or heard something strange that night. And a few houses into their search, the detectives met two young guys who said that earlier that night, before any of the commotion began, they had been working on a car in the driveway when they heard this loud bang. They had both looked around, but the street looked exactly like it always did, except that an unfamiliar car had just pulled up and parked. So they just figured the car had backfired, and that was the sound they heard. So they finished up their work in the driveway, went back into the house, and didn't think anything about it. It wasn't until at least a half hour later that they heard shouting in the street and police started showing up. For a second, Bullard and West were excited. Maybe the car they saw on the street was the black Jeep the students had been driving, and the bang they heard was the sound of the Jeep impacting the boy. But when they asked the men what kind of car it was, they both said it was an Audi. The detectives pressed, asking if, it could have been possible that it was a black Jeep instead, but the men just laughed. Mistaking an Audi for a Jeep was not something they would do. Plus, the Audi was white, not black. As the detectives walked away from the men, they exchanged a look. They weren't quite sure what to make of this report of the white Audi. It certainly did not prove their theory that the college students in the black Jeep hit their victim. However, it didn't disprove it either. Still, Bullard quickly issued a BOLO for the white Audi, which is a be on the lookout order that goes to police and media in the area. Bullard had no idea if anything would come from it. It was entirely possible that the Audi had nothing to do with the dead boy on the road. But the following morning, after the local news had run a story on the white Audi, Detective Bullard got a call at his desk. And when he answered, he heard the driver of the black Jeep from the night before, and in a shaking voice, she told Bullard that she and her friends had lied to him. A few hours later, Detectives West and Bullard sat down with the driver of the Jeep inside of an interview room at the police station. Bullard had a serious look on his face, but he didn't want to scare the driver into climbing up, so when he spoke in a calming up, almost soothing voice. He asked the driver to tell him what really happened. When the driver began to speak, she couldn't look Bullard in the eye. She said that they had not really just stumbled onto the body like they had claimed. Instead, they had all been hanging out at their dorm when another friend of theirs had called, and the first thing this friend had said was that, "Do you guys want to go see a dead body?" The driver couldn't explain to Bullard why she and the others had raced out to go see it. Maybe they were bored, or maybe it was just morbid curiosity, but as she spoke, she wiped tears from her eyes. She said that when they all got out to the body in the middle of the road, the friend who had called them about the body was standing there waiting for them. And as soon as the group saw the body, somebody shouted that they needed to call 911, but the other friend who had called them panicked. This other friend had been getting high at a nearby spot known as the Bat Cave, and at the mention of 911, she began to worry that the cops were going to bust her, so she ran off, got into her white Audi, and drove away. And shortly after that is when the man pulled up behind them, got out of his car, and he called 911. Bullard and West just stared at this young woman. On one hand, she did seem genuine. After all, she had called them, and she was admitting openly to some pretty reprehensible behavior. But on the other hand, her story didn't explain the blood and brain they had found on the bottom of her Jeep. Still, the detectives had to wait for results from tests the forensic team was running on the Jeep before they could know for sure if the Jeep and the young woman sitting in front of them had actually hit the victim. So West just told the driver that, if this really is your true story, then we need to speak to the owner of that white Audi. In a trembling voice, the young woman then told them where they could find her friend. About an hour later, at an apartment complex in town, Bullard and West crouched in front of the white Audi, looking in confusion at the undercarriage. Just like the black Jeep, there was blood spattered all over the bottom of the Audi, but this did not feel like a breakthrough. It actually didn't make any sense. Did this mean both cars had driven over the body? They quickly found the Audi's owner inside of one of the apartments. They told her they were impounding her car, then brought her to the station to question her. But she told them the same story as the driver of the Jeep, that she had gone to see the body and then, in a panic, driven away when she realized the cops were coming. Bullard and West needed to figure out who was lying, and so, really, they desperately needed the results from the forensics tests. And the following day, those results came in, and the detectives got to huge pieces of news. First, an accident reconstruction specialist said that, based on his tests, Neither the Jeep nor the Audi had actually hit the teenage boy. Instead, the boy's body had been so badly mangled that his blood and brain tissue had basically been spread all across the street. The Jeep and the Audi had simply driven through it, and their wheels splashed it onto their undercarriages. This meant that the students had been telling the truth. They did not hit the dead boy. They really had just gone to see his body and freaked out. But this was not the biggest break of the day, because the second piece of news they got came from the medical examiner. He told them that he couldn't determine the cause of death because the boy's body was too badly damaged. However, he said he had found something the detectives had missed. Crumpled up deep in one of the boy's pockets was a hall pass, like something a high school student would use to leave class and go to the bathroom. And scrolled in cursive at the top of the hall pass was a name, Delvonte Tisdale. And so now, even though their initial theory seemed to be falling apart, the detectives suddenly had their first truly solid lead. Their victim, who now had a name, was a high schooler. So, over the next several days, with help from multiple police departments, Bullard and West contacted high schools throughout Massachusetts and the nearby state of Rhode Island. But not one school had a record of a Delvonte Tisdale. It was like this kid didn't exist. And so Bullard and West began to wonder if maybe Delvonte didn't go to school in the area. Maybe he was just in town visiting someone. If that was the case, he could be from any high school anywhere. So police put out a call to major media markets across the country, asking anyone for information on this young man. And it didn't take long before Bullard got a call from a police officer. This officer had been working a missing persons case for a couple of days, looking for a 16-year-old boy named Delvonte Tisdale. However, this Delvonte Tisdale lived almost 1,000 miles away in Charlotte, North Carolina. But the timing between when the Delvonte in North Carolina went missing and when the Delvonte in Massachusetts was discovered made no sense. The Charlotte police officer said the Delvonte Tisdale he and his team were looking for had been seen in Charlotte on the same day that Bullard and West later found the body in Milton, Massachusetts. If this was the case, and if this really was the same Delvonte, he would have had to travel almost 1,000 miles and been killed and dumped in the span of maybe 12 hours. It just seemed impossible. And so the investigators all began to wonder if this was just a very strange coincidence and there really were to Delvonte Tisdale less. But when they compared the fingerprints of the body in Massachusetts and the missing boy in North Carolina, they found that they matched. About a week after Delvonte's body had been discovered, detectives Bullard and West flew from Massachusetts to North Carolina, and along with local police, they met Delvonte's family at their house. And just like the police, Delvonte's family could not believe what they were hearing. How could Delvonte have died almost 1,000 miles away from home? Delvonte's father and brother said they did not have any connections in Milton or in Boston, and on top of that, they said Delvonte was like the perfect kid. He did great in school and he was a respected member of the Rot. Nobody wanted to hurt him. Investigators asked the family if they remembered what Delvonte was wearing the last time they saw him, because when Delvonte was found out, all he had on were jeans and they were all torn up. And so, police thought if they could find his missing clothing, it might lead them to whoever had done this. Delvonte's brother said he'd seen him wearing jeans, a red shirt, and Nike tennis shoes. As West continued talking to Delvonte's dad and brother, and writing everything they said down, Bullard decided to go search Delvonte's room to see if he could find anything else that might help. And as he walked down the hallway, he heard footsteps behind him. When he turned, he saw Delvonte's younger sister. Bullard was about to ask if the girl was okay when she spoke in a quiet, trembling voice. She said her father was not telling the whole story. Bullard could clearly see the girl was nervous, so he assured her that he was there to help and that she could tell him anything she knew. That night, Bullard and West flew back home and started trying to piece together what they had learned in Charlotte and what Delvonte's younger sister had told Bullard. It would turn out, at least according to Delvonte's younger sister, that their father was really strict with Delvonte, and for some reason, their father really hated Delvonte being a part of the Rot. And so, Delvonte's sister believed there was a good chance that Delvonte had run away from home because of this and that he very likely wanted to go live with their mother in Baltimore, Maryland. Now the detectives thought this potential conflict with his father could definitely have given Delvonte a reason for wanting to run away to his mom's house. But it didn't solve the bigger mystery, which was how or why Delvonte could have ended up dead in the middle of a road in Massachusetts so soon after he'd been seen in North Carolina. And when the detectives reached out to Delvonte's mom, she had no idea if the story about Delvonte leaving his house to come possibly see her was even true. This revelation, and really everything surrounding this investigation, frustrated Weston Bullard. On the night they had found the body and then met the college students in the street, this had felt like a relatively straightforward case. And that was even before they knew who their victim was. Now they had way more information, but none of it fit together, and they had no suspects at all. And so they went back and reviewed statements from the college girls and Delvonte's family. And they also combed through the autopsy report looking for anything that could possibly point them in the right direction. When they didn't find anything new that jumped out at them, they headed back to the street where Delvonte had been found. They searched the neighborhood again in the woods that surrounded the area. They even checked out the back cave, the popular drinking and smoking spot, but they found nothing at all that gave them any ideas about what might have happened to Delvonte, which left them almost exactly where they'd been on the first night of the investigation. All they had for evidence was a badly mangled body, a bunch of tiny broken pieces of plastic they'd found in the road next to the body, and a missing red shirt and a missing pair of Nike tennis shoes. And so, feeling totally frustrated at this point, Detectives Bullard and West just did a Google Earth search of the entire area around the Milton neighborhood. They hoped that maybe this way they would find some hidden, secret route that could have led Delvonte to this street on the night of his death. And amazingly, as they looked at some of these images online, the detectives both began thinking the same thing. There was one possible hidden route that would explain how Delvonte ended up in that street without anybody seeing him. But it was so insane that it bordered on impossible, and they were almost embarrassed to say the theory out loud. In fact, this theory was so convoluted and improbable that they decided before they could say anything about it publicly, they needed to search one very specific area they'd seen in the Google Earth images to look for very specific pieces of evidence. If they didn't find this evidence there, they would never publicize this theory, but if they did find the evidence, they could actually crack the case. A little more than 2 weeks later, so in December of 2010, two investigators sent by Bullard and West walked through the dense woods of the Blue Hills Reservation, which was a forest a couple of miles from where Delvonte's body had been found. Both of these investigators felt like they were on a wild goose chase, but an assignment was an assignment, so they did as they were told and walked slowly and methodically through the underbrush with their eyes glued to the ground. And after hours of fruitless searching, one of the officers suddenly stopped cold and pointed to something just a few feet away from them. The two officers looked at each other like they couldn't believe this trip deep into the woods might actually pay off. They took a few steps closer to the object, and there, on the ground, was the evidence they had been sent out to find. They quickly bagged the evidence, hiked out of the woods, and headed right to the Milton Police Department. Detectives Bullard and West took one look at what these other investigators had found, and they both felt this huge rush of adrenaline. This was the exact evidence they had been looking for in the exact spot they hoped it would be, which meant their crazy theory had just solved the case. Back on the night of November 15th, 2010, when Detectives Bullard and West were called to the scene and they saw Delvonte's body on the road and a group of young women arguing with each other around a parked Jeep, they believed they had several strong suspects and a pile of evidence in this murder case. And it would turn out all the evidence they had found at the scene, as well as throughout the investigation, did lead them to crack the case. But after Bullard and West visited North Carolina and then came back home to piece together all of their evidence, they came to realize that Delvonte's final night alive just did not play out like they had first suspected, because the evidence didn't mean what they thought it did. Those small pieces of broken plastic that Bullard found around Delvonte's body were not from a credit card. They were from a pass for a shuttle bus in North Carolina. The loud bang that the two guys had heard while working in their driveway was not the sound of the white Audi backfiring. Instead, it was the sound of something very heavy slamming against the road at a very high speed. And Delvonte's clothing was the key to the whole thing. because Del Von Tee's missing red shirt and Nike tennis shoes were the evidence that those investigators were searching for out in Blue Hills. And when they found them, Bullard and West realized their crazy theory was correct. Because once the detectives had come back from North Carolina, they could only come up with one way Del Von Tee could have been in both states in such a short period of time. He must have flown. But taking a flight did not explain how he ended up dead in the middle of some random residential street. And that's when they came up with their new theory. They did their Google Earth search and realized the street where they found Del Von Tee happened to be directly beneath the flight path that airplanes take, flying into Boston Logan Airport. And so, with help from other law enforcement agencies, they expanded their search all along this flight path, and that included the forest of Blue Hills where Del Von Tee's clothes were found. It would turn out that on the day Del Von Tee was found dead, Del Von Tee did run away from home in Charlotte, North Carolina. But he didn't try to get a ride to his mom's house in Baltimore or to any other friend or family member's house. Instead, he used a shuttle service from a hotel to get to the Charlotte airport. There, he crept through a damaged spot in the fence around the tarmac and climbed into the wheel well of an airplane, a plane that happened to be flying to Boston later. That night, the wheel well was a dark, tight space about the size of the trunk of an average car, maybe a bit smaller, and it was filled with electrical equipment. And Del Von Tee, once inside, just sat and waited for the plane to take off. But Del Von Tee didn't realize that flying in a plane, not in the cabin, for example, like in the wheel well where people are not supposed to be, is violent and extremely dangerous. And so when the plane he had smuggled himself into began speeding down the runway, Del Von Tee would have been pressed up against a metal wall inside of the space, almost to the point of being crushed. And when the plane actually took off and left the ground and the landing gear retracted into the wheel well, it would have caused an intense amount of heat in that space. And then as the plane climbed higher and higher and higher, oxygen levels would have dropped significantly. Del Von Tee would have struggled to breathe and eventually passed out. He very likely would have died fairly early on in the flight. However, his body would have remained stuck in the wheel well behind the landing gear until about 2 hours later when the plane began its descent into Boston. When the landing gear lowered when the plane was somewhere over Milton, Massachusetts, Del Von Tee's dead body came tumbling out and fell 1,500 feet through the air. The loud bang sound the two young guys in Milton heard that they thought was the sound of the Audi backfiring, that wasn't that. That was the sound of Del Von Tee's body hitting the pavement. The discovery of what really happened to Del Von Tee left his family heartbroken and totally confused. They just couldn't understand how a teenage boy was able to sneak onto the runway of a major airport, climb into a plane's well without airport security noticing. Eventually, the family would sue the city of Charlotte for damages. However, the case was dismissed. And so, despite movies and TV shows sometimes portraying people stowing away inside of a plane while and surviving the flight, the Del Von Tee Tisdale story is proof that you can. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.